Hello all. I recently gave in to my girlfriend's wishes and decided to make her a set of dominoes. She picked out a beautiful piece of Bocote, so I started by mocking up a domino from scrap wood, mainly to finalize the dimensions and use it as a reference for the cuts. You might notice the dominoes are angled across the grain. Originally she wanted them perpendicular, but I thought that might make them too fragile, so we compromised and angled them slightly. Since the pieces were angled, I made long rough cuts on the bandsaw. In hindsight, I should have jointed the edges and used the table saw for the rest, but I was trying to save material, and that was really pointless since we had way more material than we needed anyway. Once the dominoes were cut to width, I still needed to get them to the appropriate thickness, so I turned the wood on edge and split it down the middle. This did need to happen at the bandsaw because the table saw would probably remove too much material. The next step was kind of a waste of time, and that's because I didn't joint the edges after making the cuts on the bandsaw, so the edges of the wood weren't perfectly straight, which led to tiny variances in the squareness of the ends after cutting to length on the miter saw. To address this issue and clean up the long edges of each pieces, I took all of the pieces to my crosscut sled on the table saw and ever so slightly trimmed everything. I would show you this step, but I forgot to turn on the light above the table saw, so it just looks like I'm cutting nothing over and over and over and over. With the length and the width sorted out, I still needed to finalize the thickness. Because the blanks were so small, I used my router sled, and I don't think there's a better way to handle pieces of this size. The next thing I did was mask off all of the pieces. This let me drill the pip holes and cut the center groove cleanly. It also made painting easier without bleeding into the grain. My girlfriend made this handy pip chart for me so the angle of all of the pips are correct and consistent. To make sure I actually drill the holes in the correct spots every single time, I made a guide block domino which has 5 holes on one side and 6 on the other. I also made a little jig that holds the domino and the guide block together while I drill through the guide block into the domino. In hindsight, I should have made the guide block with 7 holes per side to handle center pips better. Because I didn't do that, I had to flip the guide block after doing one side for dominoes that had center pips on both sides. After drilling each domino, I crossed it off the chart to track progress. This seems obvious, but if I'd just used a reference photo, I know I would have been dumb enough to try to remember and messed it up. Also, yes, my fingers are dangerously close to the drill bit, and if I ever do this again, I'm going to build a safer hold down mechanism. With the holes for the pips drilled out, I moved on to cutting the groove for the bar. As you can see, I did this on the bandsaw, which required some setup and test pieces. The setup you see here is a fence with a stop block and a big block, which the domino is stuck to via double-sided tape. The fence and stop block are obvious, but I'm using the big block with the domino to make it easier to ensure the domino is held perfectly against the fence, but more importantly, to make sure that the bandsaw blade doesn't destabilize the domino and slam it into the table. One modification I made after testing was using a thicker piece for the stop block and making sure to not push too much into the blade. This is because the narrow stop block made it too easy to push the right side farther into the blade than the left side, which would make for an angled, uneven cut and therefore an uncentered bar. I initially tried using a clamp instead of double-sided tape to hold the domino to the backing block, but found that if I wasn't careful, the clamp could pull the other side of the domino away from the backing block, which again made for an uncentered bar. If I were to do this again, I think I would position the stop block a bit farther back because after a while it wasn't cutting as deep. I'm not really sure why, but the result was that I needed to back off the stop block and eyeball the cut. It's also worth noting that if you do something like this, you want to be aware of how used up the double-sided tape is. In my case, the one strip was just barely enough for all of the dominoes, and I probably should have just replaced it halfway through to be safe. Have I mentioned yet that there's 28 dominoes? Up until now I didn't mind so much doing everything 28 times, but as you can tell by the speed of this time lapse, this was very time consuming and I haven't even gotten to the sanding yet. Personally, I would have liked to do gold leaf or brass or something fancy, but she wanted the pips to be black. Seeing the pips painted black, I think she was probably right, but working with gold leaf would have been a fun new experience. There's not a whole lot to say about this process other than if you do it, be a lot more thorough than I was. I somehow missed a bunch of little spots in the pips, so I eventually had to go back off camera and carefully touch them all up with a fine paintbrush. Now I am on to the sanding. The time lapse you're watching is for sanding all of the grits for exactly one domino. After realizing how time consuming this is, I timed myself for a couple dominoes and found that it takes about 10 minutes per domino. At 28 dominoes, that's 280 minutes or just over 4.5 hours. If anyone ever asks to place an order for a set of dominoes, I'm just going to tell them no, because I do not want to do this again unless they pay an absurd amount of money. That being said, I actually had to remake a few. Off camera, I tweaked the process and got way better results. If people are interested, I'd be open to redoing those early steps just to show the improved method. Now I'm on to the painstaking finishing process. I've said in a prior video that I'm done with polyurethane. Well, that was a lie. I've yet to find a better finish that works well for everything, and in this case, the wipe on poly was the chosen finish. In order to apply this to the dominoes, I use a brush to apply a heavy coat so that the finish can easily run into the pips and so that the poly fills the grain. I've yet to experiment with wood grain filler, but this probably would have been a great time to try it out. Because the dominoes are tiny and double-sided, I hold them by the long edge while brushing the face and end grain. Most folks say not to shake polyurethane, but the instructions on this container specifically say to do so. After a few hours, I flipped the dominoes, held them by the end grain, and brushed the opposite face and long edges. The next day, I repeated the process on both sides. Once fully dry, I sanded with 1000 grit, then wiped on a final coat with a clean cloth. As you might have guessed, sanding with 1000 grit was also time consuming. This clip you're watching is only half of the pieces. What you might not have suspected is the poly gunks up the 1000 grit sandpaper very quickly. As a result, I was frequently blasting the sandpaper with compressed air to try to keep it clean. Even the compressed air couldn't completely clear up the sandpaper though, so halfway through I ended up getting a fresh piece. I also noticed that the sandpaper wasn't sanding certain areas thoroughly enough, so after sanding the pieces, I hit them all with an abrasive pad that's roughly equal to 1000 grit sandpaper. This worked beautifully, except it also scuffed up the pips, so I had to refinish just the pips using a tiny brush. I was going to talk about the last coat of polyurethane, but apparently Bocote doesn't fully accept oil-based polyurethane. A couple days after the final coat, I decided to try to polish the poly and found that I was pretty easily smudging it with my fingers, so I sanded all of the pieces back down to wood and slapped on some boiled linseed oil. The difference between the poly and the BLO is actually pretty minimal, so I think they still turned out nicely, and my girlfriend loves them, which is all that really matters. I will be making a box to hold these guys in the near future, so if you'd like to see that build, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks for watching.